My name is Charmaine Watkiss, and I'm an artist who has 6 works on show at the moment in this exhibition. And they are a series of plant warrior women. And I started to look at making plant warriors about 3 years ago when I did my first solo show called The Seed Keepers. And in that show, I wanted to look at the herbal healing tradition of Caribbean women and trace that lineage back to Africa. So when I was thinking about that series of works, I then began to kind of reflect on this kind of medicinal knowledge. And I found a book that my aunt had bought me. My aunt lives in New York, and she bought me this book on herbalism about 20 years ago. And I picked up the book again, and when I read a passage in the book, it spoke about how plants have various levels of evolvement, just like humans. And so with plants being sentient beings and spiritual beings, they have different quality, different levels of spiritual evolution. And so when you ingest these plants, you're taking on those properties as well. And so I thought, what would it be like if I made people who embodied these principles? And so that's how my Plant Warrior series began. And so the first series that I did for that show was 6 plants that my parents' generation commonly used, such as burdock, ginger. And over the years, I've kind of expanded them to kind of tell lots of different stories. I realized very early on that the plants convey a story about colonialism. Because when I reflected on the plants and the medicinal knowledge that my parents' generation had, I thought, well, where did that knowledge come from? And I realized that that knowledge must have traveled from Africa along with the enslaved. That was kind of the framing of the work. And within that, there is, the posture of the women, the way they sit, the way they carry themselves, the hairstyles, all of these elements kind of have this backdrop story of colonialism, and particularly when I look at old photography and how people posed, in a very formal way, and when they sat, they always had their arms, kind of positioned in a particular way. So that was a particular symbol that I wanted to have in that. But with previous works that I'd done before, I told a lot of stories through the clothing. So I knew then that I wanted to map some of that story of the plants onto the clothing itself. There is this calmness that all of the warriors have, and I wanted to convey something around healing and to have that kind of calm and that stillness, and that encourages the viewer to kind of be very still themselves and reflect. That's kind of part of the characteristic that all plants have. When you observe a plant, you sit with that plant and you're very still with that plant. And it's that same presence and that interaction that I want to have between the viewer and the drawing. So what I'm doing with my work is tracing the lineage of African traditions and seeing how they change within different Caribbean contexts as well. Because I think for me, it's important to, connect to these stories that aren't told in the history books, particularly where it comes to plants and herbal healing traditions, because a lot of those healing traditions fed into Western science as well. People like Hans Sloane and his contemporaries particularly engaged with enslaved Africans and indigenous Caribbean people to find out what knowledge that they knew so that they could use that knowledge for themselves as well. I use the archive as a way of connecting to a lot of untold stories, and then within that, I create works that are my response to that research. I never actually make work specifically just about the research. I have like an embodied kind of response to the work. I'm trying to kind of convey a much wider knowledge and sensibility about what I'm making, because it's a story about transatlantic crossings, but it's also a story of women's empowerment, Indigenous knowledge, um, sacred knowledge as well. There's so many different layers to it, but then also this interest in plants and herbs and healing have a lot of resonance to where we are today as well, and with issues around climate change and plant ecology. All of these things are really kind of at the forefront of a lot of people's minds right now, and I think it's interesting to reflect on the past in order to perhaps reconnect to a lot of those traditions that a lot of people worldwide used to have, but it has been lost. And there's something about reconnecting to lost knowledge that is, I think, very current right now. I find that even though my work can be specific in some ways, it's very kind of international too, as well. I find that people from a broad range of backgrounds can connect to the essence of what I'm trying to say with the work. And that I find interesting because then it opens up conversation about us as a collective, as a species, and what we need to do in order to move forward. I started to look at endangered species a couple of years ago. I was invited to do a show in Lagos, and at the time I was thinking, oh, it would be nice to kind of do like a Flowers of Africa series of works. But then when I started to look at a lot of African plants, I discovered that there were quite a few that were endangered. And so I thought, let me explore that. So a couple of the endangered warriors are in this show. And the difference with those, with the endangered species, is that they hold the seed to their future survival, and they have them in an armband. And they are telling stories of why they're endangered as well. So there's one which is the national flower of Guinea, and she's got this beautiful kind of purple kind of collar, and she's got scaffolding around her, so she's in danger because of urbanization. So there's huge deforestation to build, domestic dwellings and all different kinds of buildings. So that's why that particular warrior is in danger. And then there are others that are maybe endangered because of climate change. So these issues that some of the warriors are speaking about is completely pertinent to this show. I draw myself, but they're not self-portraits. I don't see them as self-portraits because with my research, I'm researching about a collective experience. And what I'm doing is then mapping those stories, those narratives onto a figure. That whole way of working just came about completely by accident many years ago when I did a foundation, and I did some research locally about where I live, and a lot of the stories that I'd uncovered about where I live kind of resonated with my family history, and someone suggested that I do a self-portrait. And even then, when I was drawing myself, I knew that the work wasn't about me, it was about a collective experience. And so that became a vehicle for me to use to make lots of different bodies of work. And sometimes I start with a pose, and the pose can be mapped onto a large sheet of paper, or I might do a composition. And then the work starts speaking to me. It then starts telling me what it needs. And within that, I research. There's this call and response between researching and making the work until the research falls away, and then the work becomes its own thing. So it's kind of weird. I look at the work, but I don't, they look like me, but they're not me. I know there's a distance between me and the work. Once the work's done, it's its own thing, and they are in their own universe. And they purposely don't look at the viewer either. They don't break that fourth wall. It's just them in their environment. So, for example, the Anato Plant Warrior. Anato is a plant that grows in the Americas and the Caribbean, and it is also called the lipstick plant. So the seeds are red and it's got a dye within it. So it's used in food coloring, but it also has medicinal use as well. So I did a fellowship earlier this year, having a look at Hans Sloane and his the commissioned botanical drawings within his Natural History of Jamaica books. He wrote 2 volumes on the natural history of Jamaica. So he wrote about this plant as well, and how enslaved Africans and the indigenous people of Jamaica used this plant. And interestingly enough, it was used for urinary tract infections. And 400 or 500 years later, it's still used for the same purpose. So it's quite interesting how some of this early knowledge still survives today. The Anato Warrior, on her dress, I've mapped the meridian points for the urinary tract itself. And I've done it on like an indigo blue background because I wanted to make it look like it was like a celestial kind of constellation almost. And I use the indigo a lot because that was a production, that plant was produced on the plantations. Um, but it's also a sacred color as well. So she's holding this Santeria deity in her arm, which also has the seeds around its neck. Santeria is a cross between Yoruba religion, which is a West African religion, and Catholicism. So a lot of enslaved people were not allowed to practice their own religion. So this kind of hybrid religion and sacred rites came out of the transatlantic. And so with Santeria in particular, you've got the Catholic saints, but they were also Yoruba deities. So they're kind of disguised within so that people won't know that they're practicing their own sacred religion. So within that plant warrior itself, she's speaking about the sacred, and that the sacred rites have survived this journey as well. Other warriors that are connected to the sacred is the Kola warrior as well. So within that, you see the boat, and there's a deity within the boat, but then there's also a voodoo symbol on the boat itself. I know that even though all of them have exactly the same parameter or the same kind of DNA, I wanted to make them into their own characters as well. So when I work on each of them, it's as if I'm drawing a new person. So that's why they all look slightly different. No two are exactly the same. And it's my way of giving them their own life form. So, they are their own being, and they have their own story to tell, and nobody else can tell that story apart from them.